Since the Hamas-led attack on Israel almost exactly 2 years ago, the nation of Israel has rarely been out of the news. Israel is engaged in a conflict which initially had the support of nations around the world as it defended itself from the Hamas attack. But due to its continued aims to completely eliminate Hamas and having killed some 66,000 Palestinians, Israel is now the focus of international criticism for the response that it's made, considered by many nations and individuals to be a serious overreaction in how it's made that response. The nation of Israel itself, though, came into existence only 77 years ago in 1948. Prior to that, the Jews didn't have a land of their own, and they were scattered throughout the countries of the world. Now, there are still Jews living in almost every country of the world now, but the vast majority of them would regard the land of Israel as being their spiritual home, even if they don't live there. Now, Israel isn't a large country. Its population is about 10 million, which is about the same number as who live in London. It has a land area of just over 8,000 square miles, so about the same size as Wales. But it does have a strong economy. It's a wealthy nation. It operates a comprehensive social security system and social welfare program. And it's regarded as a global leader in many different fields, including science and technology. Israel is also thought, but not confirmed, to be a nuclear-armed country with a stock of up to 400 nuclear warheads. And the recent Gaza conflict is only the latest of 20 or so conflicts since 1948 with the countries which it borders. And so we ask the question, how does Israel, which we see today, a nation which celebrates its religious past but prides itself on being in the main a secular nation, which embraces modern living and modern social norms, but a country which is considered by many other countries in the world to be an international pariah and now guilty of genocide, how does the nation have anything to do with the purpose of God? And how can it possibly fit into the plan and purpose which we believe that God has with the earth? So that's what we're going to think about just for a few minutes this afternoon. And what we'll discover is that the Jewish people have always had a special part to play in the purpose of God. And even today, although they may not appreciate it, they are in fact a witness to the truth of what we find written in the Bible. And they're very much a part of God's plan and purpose that he has with the earth. So to do that, we need to think about some of the history of the Jewish people, and we need to turn to our Bibles. And the Old Testament part of the Bible is, of course, the books on which the Jewish faith is based. Religious Jews to this very day learn by heart long sections of the Old Testament writings, and many Jewish customs and traditions have their roots back in the Old Testament scriptures. Let's all, first of all, go to Deuteronomy and chapter 7. Now, most of the verses which I'm going to refer to this afternoon will be on the screen. And the references that I'm going to quote are from the English Standard Version of the Bible, which hopefully makes it just that little bit clearer to understand. And in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, these are the words of Moses, one of the leaders of the people of the Jews during the time when they were wandering in the desert, having left Egypt. We'll set the context of that a little bit later on, but this is what he said to them on that occasion. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And then he continues, it was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord has set his love on you and chose you, for you are the fewest of all peoples, but it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers. Now, for a moment, just keep in mind that last phrase about keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers. We're going to come back to that in a moment. Moving forwards in time, though, by about 1,000 years, we come to the time when the Jews found themselves in captivity in Babylon, having been forcibly taken away from the land of Israel. And God spoke to the people through the prophet Zechariah, and he said to the people on that occasion, "For thus saith the Lord of hosts, after his glory sent me to the nations who plundered you, for he who touches you touches the apple of his eye." And the apple of our eye is very sensitive, isn't it? It's what we generally think of as being the very centre of our eye, and it's something that we don't like anyone to touch. And God was saying that that's how he felt about his people, the Jews. They were precious to him, something that he valued, and he didn't like other nations touching them in any way. So those Old Testament verses, and there are others that we could go to, tell us that the Jews are clearly a people who are precious to God. And then we come to Paul's letter to the Romans in the New Testament. We're now 500 years on in history, but we see that God still felt the same way about the Jews. It's in Romans chapter 11, and Paul asks, "Has God rejected his people?" And he replies, "By no means." And he then goes on to explain further that they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So all those years on, Paul tells us that God still loved his people. And what those verses as a whole tell us is that God has a special relationship with the Jewish people, that he loves them and that they are important to him. But what we don't know at this stage is why. Why is it that the nation of the Jews is so important to God? Well, we need to think back to that verse which I told you to keep in mind a couple of moments ago, which also links to what we've just read in Romans. In Romans, we read that they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. And back in Deuteronomy, we read, "The Lord loves you and is keeping the oath which he swore to your fathers." So that leads us to ask the question, well, who were the fathers of the Jewish nation? And to understand that, we need to go back to the book of Genesis and read about the very beginnings of the Jewish people. Now, it's in Genesis chapter 11 where we read about the descendants of a man called Shem. Shem was one of the three sons of Noah who went with him into the ark. And several generations on from Shem, we read about a man called Terah, who in turn was the father of Abraham, who, as we shall see, was the father of the Jews. And then it's in Genesis chapter 12 that we read these words. So Genesis chapter 12, and the opening verse is there. "Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So God spoke to Abraham, and God promised him several things. Firstly, that he would be led to a land. Secondly, that his descendants would become a great nation, and that his descendants would be blessed. And thirdly, that Abraham's name would be great, in other words, well known. And finally, that all that other peoples who blessed Abraham's descendants would themselves be blessed, and that those who cursed his descendants would themselves be cursed. Now, for what we're thinking about today, the most important promise mentioned there was the first one, that God would lead Abraham to a land. We pick up the account in verse 4, and in verse 4 we read these words. "So Abraham went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, and Abraham took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So God now promises Abram that in time to come, the land that he at that time was looking at, the land which he could see before him, would become his. And Abram responded then by building an altar and worshipping God. And in time to come, the promises were repeated. And we could read any of the references there, which reinforce what God had said to Abram on that occasion. So God clearly promised that the land where Abraham was living would at some point be given to him and to his descendants as an everlasting possession. Now, as time went by, Abraham and Sarah had a son called Isaac, who in time became the father of Jacob, and who in time again was the father of 12 sons, from which came the 12 tribes of the Jewish nation. But the Jewish people, the people who God was making into a nation before him, still didn't own the land in which they were living, other than a single plot of land which Abraham had purchased to bury his wife Sarah. God's plan still had a long way to go, and part of that plan is detailed in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13. And this is what we read there. Genesis 15, after these things, verse 13. Well, I'll read it from the screen, why not? And the Lord said to Abraham, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. In verse 16, they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." So what God was telling Abraham was that at some point his descendants would move to another land. They'd move out of the land which God had brought Abraham to, but they'd move out of that land to another land, and they'd live there for 400 years. And then, about 400 years later, they'd come back to the land which God had showed Abraham. But by then, they would have become a wealthy and prosperous people who would at that point be able to take the land for themselves. And importantly, God is emphasizing there in verse 16 that the Amorites, who were the primary inhabitants of the land, which God had promised to Abraham, they were a wicked nation, and God wanted his people, the Jews, to drive those people out. So that was the plan. God had told Abraham what was going to happen, and these were words of prophecy, which in time would show God's chosen people that the Lord was very much in control of events. He was bringing about his plan and purpose, and that's an important principle to understand, that God, as the creator of the earth, really is in control, and he places over the nations of the world whosoever he chooses, and oversees the rise and the fall of nations according to the values and the principles which each nation holds. And on this occasion, God gave the Amorites, who at that time were living in the land which God had promised to Abraham, he gave the Amorites every opportunity to change their ways. He gave them 400 years. But he knew that the time would come when they were going to be displaced by God's own people, the Jews. And the second important principle is that the earth belongs to God. God created it, he created life upon it, and because of that, he's entitled to give the earth and parts of the earth to whoever he chooses. And we're clearly told in the Bible, in those words that we've read, that what we now call the land of Israel was land which God had chosen to give to his people, the Jews. Now, events recorded in the Bible unfolded exactly as God said they would. Jacob's family moved to Egypt, and they spent 400 years there. And they flourished, so much so that they became a threat to the Egyptians. And the Jews, or as we might sometimes refer to them, the children of Israel, Jacob's name having been changed from Jacob to Israel, a name which interestingly means one who struggles with God, and there's a lot of significance in that. The Jews left Egypt with great riches, and God took them on a journey through the wilderness of Sinai. And it was a journey which, for various reasons, lasted some 40 years. And during that time, God formed them into a nation of people. He formed them to a nation who he wanted to reflect his principles and values by the way in which he hoped they would obey his law. God gave the people a law which embodied his principles of fairness and of justice, and a law which clearly established God as being their king. And he set out a system of worship, a system which required the people to live in a way, both individually and a nation, which reflected God's values. He required the nation to be a holy nation before him, a nation which was set apart, a nation which gave glory to God's name, and was a witness to God before the other nations of the world by the way in which they conducted themselves. And much later on in the Bible, we read these words of God recorded through the prophet Isaiah. It's actually for reference Isaiah chapter 43 and verse 10. And God says, "You are my witnesses." So the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, were to be God's witnesses in that what happened to them throughout history would prove that the words of God were true. So God brought the people out of the land of Egypt, and after 40 years, when the people had learnt about the principles of the Lord God, they were ready to take the land which God had promised to Abraham. And it's the book of Joshua that tells us all about how the land was initially taken. And with God's help, the conquest of the land then continued over many years. Joshua had many successes. There was a period of mixed success during the time of the judges, and then victories took place again during the time of King David. And in time, Jerusalem became the capital of the land. An impressive temple was built, and the glory of the Lord was present in the temple. And it was at that time that God's people were now a nation in the land which God had promised to them. The very same land which Abraham had looked at all those years before, and which God had promised he would give to Abraham's descendants. But there were conditions. God required his people to live in a way which he'd set out. And he set out that way in the law which he'd given to them. And it was a law which required the people to give God honour and respect in their worship. And God had said that he would bless them and help them and support them in their nationhood if it was that they were loyal to him. But he warned them that if they turned against him, he would turn against them. We read that very clearly in Deuteronomy chapter 28, where we see a list of blessings which the people would receive if they were loyal to God and did his will. But we also read an even longer list of curses or troubles, if you like, which God would bring on them if they were disobedient before him. And one particular warning in that chapter was particularly serious. Deuteronomy chapter 28. He told the people, "If you are not careful to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that you may fear this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, then the Lord will bring on you and your offspring extraordinary affliction severe and lasting, and sickness grievous and lasting. And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. And among these nations you shall find no respite, and there shall be no resting place for the sole of your foot, but the Lord will give you there a trembling heart and failing eyes and a languishing soul." Now, the kingdom of Israel, as we've seen it established in the land, on the map that you saw there, the kingdom of Israel lasted for many years. But over time, God's people chose to turn away from God and to do all the things which God hated. They chose to worship the false gods of the surrounding nations, and they chose to live in ways which were displeasing before the Lord. And God sent prophets time and again to warn the people that they should turn back to him, with the promise that he would continue to bless them. But those warnings fell on deaf ears. And eventually, the northern part of the kingdom was taken by the Assyrians, and many of the people were deported into captivity. And later, the southern part of the kingdom was then taken by the Babylonians, and again, people were taken into exile. And at that time, for a period of some 70 years, the land that God had promised to his people was empty of all but the poorest of the Jews. After 70 years, some of the people were allowed to return to the land to pick up the thread of national life, but they remained as subjects to the Persian Empire initially, and then to the Greeks, and then, in time to come, it was the Roman Empire who ruled over them. But never again, at least not until 1948, was the land of Israel an independent nation. And that was the situation when we come to the New Testament and we read about the birth of Jesus. The miraculous birth of Jesus and his preaching to the people was a further appeal for the people to return to the principles of God which he'd set out for them, and once again to place their full trust and reliance upon him. God had previously sent prophets to warn the people, but they'd ignored him. They'd ignored the prophets and the message that he sent via the prophets. And he was now sending his son in the hope that they'd listen to him and come back to worshipping the Lord in the way that he'd asked of them. Well, if we're familiar with the New Testament account, we know only too well what happened, don't we? Instead of accepting the message which Jesus brought, the Jewish religious leaders instead rejected it out of hand and sought to silence Jesus by having him put to death. And in so doing, they were again turning their backs on God and opening themselves up to what God had said he would do and the troubles which he would bring on the nation. And so it was in the events of AD 132, when the Jews revolted against their Roman overlords. It was those events which then sealed their fate. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were sold into slavery across the Roman Empire and beyond. It's what historians refer to as the Jewish diaspora, the Jewish people expelled from their own land and scattered throughout the nations of the world. And as migrants, they became despised, reviled, and hounded by persecution, very often because they were actually successful in whatever they turned their hands to, and they became wealthy as a result. And probably the persecution which we're most familiar with is the German persecution which took place under Hitler, a period during which some 6 million Jews lost their lives in terrible ways simply because they were Jews. But even today, as we've recently witnessed in Manchester, many people are still hated by many Jews, are still a hated people throughout the world, and are persecuted as a result of the fact simply that they are Jews. And so we ask a question: has God now completely rejected his people Israel? Are they now no longer part of his plan and purpose? Has he had enough of the fact that they have refused over the years to obey him and have failed to show an example to the people around them as to how God expects people to live? Well, when Paul was writing in the New Testament, he asked the very same question in that verse that we've already made reference to. Let's remind ourselves, Romans 11 verse 1, he says, "I ask then, has God rejected his people? And he goes on to answer the question, by no means. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. And then he goes on to explain that although many of the Jewish people have turned away from God, there have always been a faithful remnant of those who have remained loyal to the Lord and understand his plan and purpose. You see, the fact is, God doesn't break his promises. And many years before, as we've read, God had promised to Abraham that the land that he was going to give them was to be for an everlasting possession. That's what we read back in Genesis chapter 17 and chapter 48 as well. And so God's purpose continued. And it was through God's prophets who spoke to the people, the prophets who had warned the people to turn again to the Lord, the prophets who had told the people that they would be spread amongst the nations of the world. It was those same prophets who also spoke of a time which would come when the people would be regathered to the land which they'd been promised, and once again would become a recognized nation of people. And that's what we read together in our reading from Ezekiel chapter 36. That's one of the prophecies which speaks of the regathering of the Jewish nation. Words spoken through Ezekiel. Ezekiel had been instructed by God to give many warnings to the people as to what would happen if they didn't turn back to God, but he'd also been able to give an assurance to the people that although they were dispersed among the nations, or would be dispersed among the nations, a time would come when they'd be regathered by God and brought back to the land which he promised to them. Let's remind ourselves of what we read together in our reading from Ezekiel 37.
The hand of the Lord came upon me, and brought me out in the spirit of the Lord, and set me down in the midst of a valley, and it was full of bones. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. And he said to me, Prophesy to these bones, and say to them, I will put sinews on you, and bring flesh upon you. Cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they lived and stood upon their feet, an exceedingly great army. Thus saith the Lord, Behold, O my people, I will place you in your own land, and then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken it and performed it.
And that's exactly what happened. And it was back in 1897 that the first Zionist Congress took place in Basel in Switzerland. And this proved to be a pivotal moment in the history of Zionism. It was convened by Theodor Herzl, who aimed to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. And the Congress established the World Zionist Organization, which under the leadership of Chaim Weizmann campaigned tirelessly towards furthering the stated aim of the Zionist movement of establishing a homeland for the Jews. And over the course of the next 50 years, progress was gradually made. And after the First World War, when the British were in control of Palestine, they supported the implementation of the so-called Balfour Declaration. And this was a declaration which supported the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, whilst also ensuring the rights of the existing Arab population. And from 1920 onwards, a period during which the British remained in control in Palestine, more and more Jews began returning to live in what was then called Palestine. And the final push for Israel to become a nation in its own right came about following the persecution of the Jews during the Second World War. Hitler's repression of the Jews precipitated a chain of events which finally resulted in Israel being declared as a nation on the 14th of May 1948, when David Ben-Gurion became Israel's first prime minister. But as we said right at the start, the history of modern Israel has been a troubled and turbulent one, with almost countless wars between Israel and the countries which it borders, as well as further afield. The Israelis are a proud people. They hold their country is very precious to them. And never before has a nation which existed hundreds of years ago but was driven out of its land, never before has a nation like that gone on to survive a 2,000-year dispersion and then come back to life as a nation in its original land. And the Jews are very proud of that fact. Indeed, it's a remarkable fact. And yet it's exactly what the Bible said would happen. And we've read that prophecy in Ezekiel where God said that he would regather his people and that he'd reform them back into a nation. And there are other similar prophecies other than that one that we read from Ezekiel chapter 37, which speak of God regathering the Jewish people to the land which he promised to them. So it was, the events which have taken place have been under God's control, and which can only be described as the miracle of the Jews, and the formation of the state of Israel is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. But the fact is that the nation of Israel, which exists today, isn't a nation which recognizes God to any great extent. It's a very proud nation, but it's a nation which considered that it's achieved what it's achieved by its own efforts. Very few in Israel today would consider that God has had any part to play in events which have taken place in recent history. And that leads us to consider the next part of God's plan, because God's plan with his people and the earth in general isn't as yet complete. And the time will come when the people of Israel will once again recognize God as being in control of all things. And just as God provided accurate prophecies about what was going to happen to his people Israel in the past, so it is that he's provided prophecies about what's still to happen. And there's a whole series of prophecies that we could look at and fit them together, which tell us that another catastrophe is facing the nation of Israel. This is what the prophet Zechariah tells us in chapter 14. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half of the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. And by reading other prophecies, we find that it's at a time that it's at that time that the Jews will finally come to recognize the power of God, and most significantly will recognize Jesus as being God's Son, the one who will return from heaven to rule over the whole world from his throne in Jerusalem. And that's what we read in Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 10. He says, I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps for a firstborn. So there's much ahead. We live in exciting times when nations are turning against Israel because of their attitude towards others. And we believe that this signals the time when the events that we've read about in Zechariah will shortly come to pass, when a final conflict is going to take place in the land of Israel, referred to in Revelation chapter 16 as the Battle of Armageddon. And most importantly, the time when Jesus will return from heaven and begin the task of setting up God's kingdom upon the earth. And that's something which the Bible tells us we can all have a hope of being part of, a part of sharing in. By coming to an understanding of God's relationship with his people, the Jews, and by embracing the teaching of the Lord Jesus and of the New Testament writers, we can come to share in the promises which God made to the fathers of the nation of Israel so long ago. The world is going to change, because under the rulership of the Lord Jesus, the suffering and divisions and the inequalities which we see in today's world will in time be done away with, and the law of the Lord will go forth from Jerusalem. And it's the prophet Isaiah who gives us this picture. He says that a time is coming when the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And that's truly a wonderful promise, isn't it? And we can all have part in that promise if it is that we believe in the God of heaven and if we commit ourselves to serving him in our lives and seek to do his will. The nation of Israel is a remarkable witness to the fact that God is in control of the world in which we live. And it's as the prophet Daniel tells us, that it is God who rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will.